Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today's KETIV Virtual Academy session. In today's topic, we're going to be talking about the best practices in part numbering with Phil and Jason. We're so glad that you're all here and took time out of your day to join us. And we hope that you're all enjoying the value that we bring to these sessions and the content that you've been learning and consuming. On the next slide here, we have a list of our upcoming KVA sessions. The next sessions for the next 2 weeks, as well as a few other events that our teams will be attending that you can be a part of. You can check out this link on our website to join us at both Autodesk University 2022 and the International Manufacturing Technology Show. If you're someone who's continuously coming back for more at our KETIV Virtual Academy sessions and you're not already partnered with us, we would love to help your company digitally transform and take advantage of our current pricing promotions. We have 0% financing options for some softwares that we will be using in today's session. Ultimately, we want to work to become your reseller of choice. So you can see our contact information at the bottom here. Don't hesitate to reach out and see how KETIV can help you, not only with this learning content, but with the full scope of your team strategy and your team's business needs. Also, at the end of our session today, you'll see a link to provide us with some feedback on the content that you've seen today. You can send your suggestions for content that you want to see. So please fill that out to help us continue to improve our sessions for you and provide you with the lessons that will help you and help your team. Thank you again, everyone, for joining, and I'll let Jason take it away.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so just at a high level, we're going to go over some questions, just kind of get an idea of where people are at with part numbering. We're going to get into why it's important, why, what things to consider when choosing. We'll get into how do we implement some of these strategies in Vault and some of the things to think about as we're configuring in Vault, and then especially thinking long term, as we'll see later. Part numbering has a cascading effect on the business, on other business applications like PLM, ERP, and so we'll get into it. As an introduction, we have myself, Phil, and I as part of the data management team here at KETIV, and we'll get started. So we're just curious. We'll give you guys a few minutes. I'm just curious to see where people are at, Does your company have some sort of standard or part numbering procedure? Do you guys have a format? Do you have a dedicated CAD admin that's making sure everyone's following these procedures? And then the lastly is, do we have unique file name turned on, which is super critical. If you can't find what you're looking for because you have 12 files that all say part 1, it's hard to reuse content. We'll just give everyone a few more minutes to fill in the poll questions. And while we wait for you guys to fill in the poll questions, just a reminder, we have the Q&A option on Zoom. And so feel free, as long as we're going on, put in your questions and we'll try to answer them. Okay, awesome. So we got the results back. It seems like a pretty close mix between people that have a CAD admin versus companies that don't. It seems like everyone has a good amount of people have some sort of company standard. A few don't. And we have a good mix about how do we implement those standards or formats. It seems an interesting, pretty close to a quarter split between automatic numbering, smart part numbers, free for all or free text, and then no formatting scheme, and a good split between unique file names not. So that's interesting. Okay, and we'll get started. Thanks for your feedback. So the reason why we're talking about part numbering is to continue this series that we talked last time about CAD admin. As far as I'm concerned, part numbering is probably one of the core things that a CAD admin and any company really needs to think about, whether they're using a PDM system like Vault or not, because the part numbering affects everything. It affects how you find your files. It affects, like I mentioned, when we try to share data with other systems. It definitely affects when a company buys another company. How do you merge those two part numbering schemes together? And the first thing that I always come back to is, do you have a standard? And I think that every customer should have a standard. We'll see some examples. Some can be very complicated, but at the very minimum, it's good just to think about these standards and not just name things however we want. And I've seen over the years all kinds of things from, part numbers that were just started with auto numbering and, starting with 0001 with no information, all the way to, a number dash the description dash the rev. And so we want to be more mindful about how we're using part numbering, because it has such a long effect. And then, as you're thinking about these standards, we need to think about, like, will these standards still be in use in 10 years? Is there room to grow? Do we want intelligent part numbers? And I've seen some really great examples of intelligent part numbering, from adding value so that you can look at a part number and know, does it go on the front part of a plane, the back part of a plane? Does the part numbers let you know what vendor it's coming from? There's a lot of interesting things you can do with part numbers to add more value or more information to the actual file name or part number. And with Vault, as we've seen before, with all the metadata, we might not need a more complex Italian part number like we might have in the past, where we can leverage some of those other properties. And then also, things to think about when you're picking a number, readability, how much value comes from that, especially if it's very complicated. I think whenever you're looking at a part number scheme, we should think about, when you hire someone new in 10 years, how much extra training you're going to have to do to get them up to speed about what all these sub numbers mean, especially if you go for an intelligent part numbering system. How intuitive is it? Is it readable? Is it easy to understand? And then, we can't not think about mergers and acquisitions. Does your part standard allow for growth if you plan or have aspirations to acquire another company, or you've acquired and merge, catalogs merge, design data or vaults or PDM servers? How do you manage the two and leverage the content? One of the main benefits of Vault is having all of your CAD data in one location. And so being able to reuse content and not always having to remodel or model something from scratch, but able to re-leverage purchase parts or library parts. And so there's a lot of benefit. And the reason why we're talking about this is, if we think about, if we don't talk about part numbering and, you're 10, 15, 20 years into Vault, or, managing CAD data, whether it's in or out of Vault, as you might realize, it's time, it's expensive to change the standard. And so if you have the opportunity now, before you add more data or create more data, we can really limit the amount of effort it takes to change. And so that's really why we're talking about it here, is because, the name of a file might seem, when we look at one file, it'd be insignificant. When we think about vaults that have 100 gigs, a terabyte of data in there, part numbering starts to really play a big role.
I think the last thing you might not have said, Jason, was the part numbering. So later on, when you attach it to ERP or somewhere else.
Oh, absolutely. Because if you're going to share data, ERP or PLM, it's one of those things that we have to think about now, because if you're planning to eventually link the two, it's something that needs to be addressed now rather than later. Because if you wait and you link the two together, or you've inherited a system because you're a new CAD admin, a new company, you're not just renaming files in the PDM server, you could also be renaming items and data in the ERP or PLM system. And that becomes very complicated when you have release content and how to track the history of that. And especially when you're in an industry where you need that traceability, can be or you're in the process, those kinds of just something as simple as renaming content and cleaning up whichever system, whether it be the files on a local share or an ERP or PLM. It's not going to be done in a day. And so you also have to think about a plan of how do you manage those other business units that require or use the part numbers or file names like purchasing while you're going through the transition. And so this is part of the reason why we're talking about it now. Is the sooner we can get to a numbering scheme, the better.
Well, and how many customers have we run across over the last couple of years that say they have clean data and that they're asking us to move that data into Vault form, and we spend a lot of time having to rename a lot of their files because they really don't have clean data because their naming scheme has changed several times in the past.
Yeah, that's a great point, because computers are smart. You can get them to do a lot of things. The thing that it's very hard is if your naming scheme doesn't follow a format and now you have 5 different formats or 12 different formats. It's not a very simple program. You now have to add all this extra logic that's very easy for a human to look at the part number and know what needs to change. But to programmatically get the computer to change part numbers is something that can be very challenging. I would almost rather, if you had a part number you need to change, I would almost rather the part number follow a standard 100% and be wrong than have 12 or 15 different standards that get followed some of the time. The level of effort to clean up those two is drastically different. And so some examples of part numbering, we have the simple auto number, also known as a dumb number. Basically, it doesn't add any value. It could be any format, but it could be all letters, numbers, that are basically auto numbering. You have somewhere in between where you start to add some smart numbering to, whether it's a prefix that encapsulates a project number and then you just auto number. It could be free text where all the files for a particular project have a prefix. There's an unimaginable amount of ways to do smart numbering, and the 3 things that are worth keeping in mind is, how does it grow and expand? Will you be using this smart numbering system in 3 years? Because that's the hard part with most smart numbering, is that it works great for the first couple of years, and then when you grow to another assembly line or another product, you can very easily outgrow a smart numbering scheme. And then you have some hard choices. Do you now do 2 different smart numbering schemes? Do you abandon it? What do you do with the old numbering? And so there's a lot to think about. The first question really is, do you want a smart number or just regular file numbers that have no real extra meaning? And then if you pick smart numbering, how smart do you want those numbers to be? Depending on the company you're in, I suspect, unless you're a startup, most of this has already been decided. You've inherited your vault and you're stuck with what you have. And if you're some of the lucky ones that are starting new or are moving files into Vault, you have an opportunity to make a decision of how Vault will be set up, and done right, the CAD admin in 10 years will thank you. And these are just 2 examples. I've seen some smart numberings that have 20 dashes, everything from locations, plants, sub-assemblies, sub-components. You can make it as complicated and as simple as you want. I find I always err on the side of simplicity, especially when we think about a modern age of acquiring other companies or other parts, finding a way to leverage some of the other metadata in terms of description, especially when you're using Vault where you can search by their metadata. The part numbers really come in handy if you're using like a Windows file share where you can only search the file name. And so it's those things we have to kind of balance out. And so the real important, especially like, for you that have been using Inventor and Vault, we know that when you create a file in Inventor automatically sets the part number to be identical to the file name. And we know once that file gets into Vault, that part number is what's used when you assign an Inventor file to an item. And most scenarios, when you link Vault or PDM server to PLM or ERP, you usually sync the item. And so you need a one-to-one relationship between the item numbers in Vault and the item numbers in PLM or ERP, which is simple if you're starting with a new PLM or a new ERP system. You can sync it all one direction. You have a lot more flexibility. But if you're in an environment where you've been kind of coexisting with an ERP system and Vault and they're not together, that adds another layer of complexity, because now you need to clean up both systems. You need to get them to match. And then the other place that really starts to play into effect of, if you're going to items, most likely you're going to have a bill of material. And so that all goes back to having the standards, not just in how we name our files, but also a standard of how do you model how detailed of a bill of material structure do you need and or want, and making sure everyone follows that. And the reason we're talking about this now is it's someone that's worked on a fair amount of cleanup projects. Cleaning up part numbers and file names and item numbers is a tremendous amount of effort, just because of the scale, the magnitude of the project. And so if we can think about these things sooner, I've seen companies where you hire a full-time person that does renaming, or a large customization project using APIs and the GTU tool to really kind of clean up and reset. And so if we can avoid all that, you're saving yourself time and money. And so
not everybody has an Atom to write custom programs to rename stuff.
Exactly. And so we'll get into Vault here. And so at some of the examples we can see and so in Vault has a numbering scheme. And so if you have administrative roles, we can come in here to the Vault settings, under behaviors down here to numbering. And there's a couple things to think about. There's two things. So up to now, I've been basically really talking about just the procedure and what's available. But once you come up with a numbering scheme, you still have to decide how it gets implemented. Is it just a format and the end users track it in an Excel document, search the Vault for the latest or the highest number, and then the next file gets that particular number? Do you use the automatic numbering scheme in Vault? There's more than one way to implement a numbering scheme. If we're going to use the feature in Vault to create a numbering scheme, there's a couple of things that we need to think about. The first is that once you create a numbering scheme, as soon as you generate one file with the numbering scheme, I can no longer edit this numbering scheme. And so I made this one. It matches that example of basically having a project number. And so Vault gives us a lot of different options. We'll go over them in a minute, but in this case, I basically used the free text to be able to add a value for, in this case, a prefix P for projects. I could have written out projects. In this case, free text, meaning that when I create a number, anyone can type in whatever project number, and then we can set our hard code, a delimiter, and this can be almost any value. And so it's just a value that meets the criteria, but doesn't allow the end user to input anything. And then we have, in this case, the function that allows us to auto number. And so there is some customization ability that we can do for the auto numbering. If we need to change the range later on, we have that ability. But in terms of changing the actual format, once you start using it, it's very limited in what you can do. And so if I go to Vault or Inventor, when I create a new file, as long as I have that numbering scheme activated and I'm logged into Vault, when I click save, I will get this particular window to pop up. And so if we had more than one numbering scheme, we can select what we want. In this case, I only have one. My only input as an end user is just to type in whatever the project number is. And so if we pick a new project number, the auto generation is basically, since I know that I have never generated a file for project 3, then this auto generator is going to start at 1. If I do it again, it'll start at 2, etc. And so I'll just save this. And so once the file gets created, if I needed to change something, add a prefix or a suffix, I could. It's just good to know that once a file gets generated and saved, like this number 1, if I go and try to create another file for project 3, it should auto generate to number 2 and etc. And so we'll check this into Vault so that we have it. The one thing to be mindful of when you're thinking about using Vault tool to create auto numbering is that the auto numbering, as we can see, always starts at 1. And so for every prefix, whether it's free text, a drop-down menu, etc., for this series, it's always going to start at 1. And so we can see that project 3 starts at 1, project 2 starts at 1, etc. And that's part of the reason why, if we run out of numbering, that Vault gives us the ability to come in here and extend the range. Because if we didn't have this ability and I had to make another numbering scheme, the auto generation would start back at 1, which is not what we want. And so that's something to be mindful of, is that in this particular case, we can extend and add more numbers, but as soon as we use it, I couldn't come back here and decide like, oh, I really wanted this this numbering scheme to say project instead of P. And so that's where things get tricky, because so if I wanted to make another one of these, I could name it whatever I want. We'll say project. And so we have to add these kind of different options. And so we have the first one I want in this particular case would be fixed text, so that it's not going to be, so that can't be edited. And so we'll just put project in here. And then in this case, if I do project, the next will be a part number. But if I wanted a space, that's where we would use something like the delimiter if I wanted a space, or we'll do a dash in this case, so it's easier to read. And then if I wanted to use the same free text, allowing an end user to just type in whatever number they want, I could do a predefined list if I want to limit what the options are. And so the predefined list can work well if you only want someone to have like 4 or 5 options. In this case, if you think that you might eventually get to all of the numbers, it might be easier to do free text. That way you have a little bit more options on project number. And then we have to decide, what's the starting value? Do we get to start at all zeros? Do we want start at 1? We can set what the default value is, but we have to set a max value. And so in this case, we want 4 characters because we don't want the project number to be more than 4 characters. And so now we have the first part of, now we just need the auto number, but before that we want, let's say, another delimiter, so another dash. And so we can basically use all of these different options to build the structure that we want. And so from here, now we just need to add the auto generation sequence. So we'll call it auto number. And then this is where we're going to decide we're starting. So we'll start with 4 characters. And then if we prefer to start with 1 instead of 4 zeros, we can do that and click OK. And so as soon as we get this the way that we want, we can click OK. It's now becomes an active project. I can still come back in here and edit this. As soon as I generate the first project or the first file with this numbering scheme, that's when I can no longer make changes to the numbering scheme. And so it's important to do some testing, generate a few files, make sure you have it right. Because if you made a mistake, it's easy to delete those 2 files from Vault and remake the numbering scheme. You don't want to find a mistake like that after you've generated hundreds or thousands of files. And again, so once we make something, I'm a big fan of testing. And so we'll just make another file. And so in this case, now that we have 2 active numbering schemes, whatever one's on top will be the default. And so at this point, we can type in whatever project number we want. In this case, I'll just leave it as 1.
I have 2 questions going on that I have, Jason.
Sure.
First is if you already have clean part numbering situation, but you want to swap to a modified version of the numbering scheme, is it still impossible? Is it still an impossible task?
You have clean. It depends. Yeah. Are you using Vault to pre-generate? Are you managing them yourselves? And when let's see, swap the numbering scheme. So you could make a new numbering scheme active, but it's not going to affect any of the files that are already been generated by the previous one.
The second one, can you come back to edit the predefined list after starting? It sounds like once you add 1 file, you no longer can make that change, correct?
Let's double check for sure, because that's a good question. Okay, so we'll do list. We will do predefined list, project, or actually do location. Code, California, Oregon. That's good enough. Okay. And so when you're creating a predefined list, you have to give, you have to have at least set one of them to be the default, or you'll get those red icons. And then let's just add a simple delimiter, and then we'll add an auto generation next to it. And then that way that'll give us a good test. So and we need to go make a file so that we use it. Okay, so now that we've made 1 file, let's come back up here and double check to see what kind of options we have in terms of making changes. So come back here to list, click edit. Yeah, so once the predefined list has been created, as soon as you generate 1 file, you can't edit the list. All you can do is change the range for the auto number. And the hard part is that you could technically make a second numbering scheme and make it identical and add, let's say a 4th location. The reason why that doesn't work is that we can set the auto number to start at whatever value we want, but depending on how many files were generated for each location, the starting number will be different. And so would make it unusable to just delete it and remake a different numbering scheme. And so that's one of the hard parts about at least any automatic generation of a list, is that if you don't account for all of these different locations, as the years go on and your needs grow, the smart numbering you can be limited. But if this case, instead of auto numbering, if this was like free text where you just typed in a number, that would work. But then you have the problem is that now you have to search Vault to figure out what's the highest number for that particular sequence, and so that's part of the reason why I want to show this, is that there's some great features in here. We just need to think about them long term so that we don't implement a numbering scheme and then realize a couple of years down the road that we need to change it, and now we're stuck. That's what I really want the takeaway to be about, is that if it's just to spend a little bit more time thinking about these things. And it's exciting when we get Vault or we start creating data and we start saving data. The numbering schemes are super important and have cascading effects. And as most of you know, are hard to change later. And so it's just good to know the cause and effect of some of our choices so that we're aware of how we can grow some of these procedures and some of these numbering schemes. That's a great question.
Another question, can you use a numbering scheme that does not auto number?
Correct, absolutely. You don't need to create an auto number. We could you could create one text and just do something like fixed text, so you could put whatever you want. So if you wanted everything to start with letter AA, and you could do a delimiter, but you could also just, instead of breaking it out in two separate line, you could put it in the free text. So free text and delimiter is similar. The delimiter really comes in handy if you're going to do back-to-back drop-down lists, but we could do free text, and then we could do project number, and then I want free text, project number, default value. And so you have to specify what the max length is. So that's something to think about if you make that too small, but that we could just stop there and so we come in here and just type in whatever we want. So that's definitely a possibility. It's also possible of knowing what the scheme is and just getting, as the CAD users are making the models, especially if you're doing, let's say, like a new product, thinking ahead of time of what do you want the parent assembly to be named? What do you want sub-assemblies to be named? What format do you want child parts to be named? And if you're starting from scratch, make the assembly, make the BOM structure, with no data, if you're doing purely bottom-up modeling. And then from there, you could then come back and 3D model everything. It just depends on the way that you model, the way that you start, and the way that, because it depends on the products you're making. Some of your guys' customers, you might be doing a purely top-down workflow. You're just placing in 80% of purchase parts, of pipes, of tubing, of valves, and then maybe, modeling a little bit. Or, you could be basically making something from scratch, even there, you could still pre-make all the files and name them that you would want, at least at like a high level. And so if we think about something as simple as a table, even though tables can be very complicated, you could pre-name the top, you could pre-name a leg, you could pre-name hardware or their connection, and basically, instead of just diving into a new project and just start modeling, taking a step back and thinking about how you want things to be structured, that's definitely an option.
You have one more question in there, Jason.
Sure. So if I want to modify version of the numbering scheme using the vault, I guess I have to, so can I have two almost identical, but one have additional fields or two at the end? You could definitely have two different numbering schemes and that are slightly different. Especially if you want to add like a prefix or a suffix at the end. The place where it gets complicated is if you're using auto numbering on one of them, then the two auto numbering generations will be out of sync. It's definitely something that's worth running a few tests and generating, 5, 10, 15, 20 files just to make sure that it does what you want, so that you don't find yourself in a spot where you're kind of stuck and you have to go back to manually creating them. Yeah, that's a great question. And that's why it's good to think about these things. I'm a big component of creating a test vault and tweaking some of these settings and really putting them through their paces so that you understand the limitations and the options of what you're deciding to do, especially before you get to creating data that gets released and now it's a controlled document and makes things a lot more complicated. As most of you know, with the rename tool or with copy design, there's ways of easily adding prefixes and suffix, especially in Vault Pro. You can do define and replace in the copy design, and so there's definitely ways of duplicating and cleaning up some of the files. And the same thing when it goes to rename, you can use some of the naming schemes in the rename options. And so it just depends on what's available and what you're trying to do. And so there's definitely some options in terms of cleaning things up, but it's definitely far easier to take the time and set things up the way that you want ahead of time, so you're not having to do the cleanup effort. Okay, so let's see, if I already cleaned the part numbers, but I want to swap to a modified version of the numbering scheme, is there a way? Yeah, once the file has been created, you could use the rename tool to swap it to the next, to rename it using the new numbering scheme. That's definitely possible. But I wouldn't do that for your entire vault. That'd be very time consuming. If you need to make changes or had desired to rename everything in your entire vault, that's where a project with a reseller to use something like the DTU tool would be more beneficial if you're doing a mass amount of renaming. Or that's a good project for a summer engineer if you're, it just depends on the level of scale at which you're trying to rename. But yeah, these are great questions. We have time for a few more if there's any more. So yeah, just kind of to recap, it's, you know, and this is one of the hard choices of a CAD admin, especially if you're the only person at your company, is, you know, you don't have people to bounce ideas off, you know, sometimes you're in a vacuum, but it's very easy to overlook file naming, part numbering conventions. But, you know, because these part numbers or these file names affect the part numbers, and the part numbers affect, you know, if I were to add this to an item, it's like, you know, it affects the item number. You know, it's easy to forget the cascading effects, especially if you're currently not using items or haven't started down a project to link Vault to ERP, but it's definitely worth thinking about, especially, you know, as your companies are going to keep creating data. And so even if you just started with a new numbering scheme, like if you have one that's not working, you know, one option is to think about what the new one will be, and then at least have all new projects in a new way. There's definitely ways of going about it, especially when we think about making the PLM and ERP. You know, that's definitely one approach, is only syncing latest products and then basically cleaning up the data as you work on it, because not every company has the time or the luxury to do a mass cleaning of the entire vault, or the time or the energy it takes. Sometimes it's one of those things that it's just easier to clean over time as you update a file or a product, especially when you're going from different revs. Okay, so what are some common fields you see customers use in their numbering scheme? Location, project number, are there others? If you search online, there's all kinds of examples. It really depends on the industry. The example that's coming to mind is, you know, I forget, it was like a big, I think it was like a big airline engine, and basically having a part number to let you know, is it in the front or back, left or right side of the engine, so you could look at the part number and know, like for the people that are servicing the engine, where that part goes without even having to look at the schematics, at least get into the ballpark. And so you can do some really interesting things with smart part numbers. It's just having the forethought of what you need and how does it grow, and can you maintain those smart numbers through an acquisition or merge, or is it just going to turn into a headache later? But anything could be essentially a smart number. It's just, what kind of value do you need? And it's things like location, project number, other things, all of that essentially could be captured in a user-defined property. All these user-defined properties that could be added to the columns up here, and we could sort and search by them. And so I would argue that for very complicated smart numbering schemes, probably don't make that much sense, because of the more complex they are, the harder they are to stick with. And the last thing you want is a number scheme that degrades over time. And, you know, what adds value today is almost useless 5-10 years from now. Okay, here's another question. When it comes to waiting on vault or planning, going ahead with vault editing as you go, should you have a fully defined description created guideline before vaulting anything, or are you okay with a little variety? Most likely you already have files on a network share or on your computer at the very least. And so if it's only a few projects, you know, you could easily vault those as you're deciding what your numbering scheme should be, because you could rename 1,000, 10,000 files with only a couple hours, you know, depending on the complexity in the scheme. It might take you 5-10 minutes, if you're doing 10,000, 100,000 parts. At that point, things become more complicated. But in terms of getting started, I'm a big believer of adding a few sample projects, getting things figured out, because most people learn by doing. And so by getting it in there, starting to figure out that, what metadata is coming over, what do you need to search on? But I agree with you. The idea of waiting until you have this perfect vault and everything dialed in is unrealistic too. So I think you got to find the balance of what you need in terms of getting files into vault. I've seen some vaults where every file extension has its own category and it has perfectly tuned user-defined properties, and that works fantastic if you have the time and what metadata you have. But if your product line varies and your specs vary, it's hard to dial in those kind of vault settings, and so it just depends. But the biggest thing is just getting the files into vault so you can start leveraging the search capability of the metadata. Whereas when you have your files on a shared drive or on your local computer, you can only search by the file name, so that makes it hard to find and reuse content. Great. Well, I appreciate all the questions. If we have time for one more, if there is, if not, there's always the next time. And we'll continue this series in the line of thinking about, what is it that we need to kind of take a step back as a CAD admin and really think about vault. And so in the near future, we'll be talking about, how do we vault inventor design data, start parts, how do we centralize as many things as we want, and how do you vault and take care of a standard? Because whether it's a part numbering standard or procedures, as a CAD admin, all that should be written down so that when you have a new user, you have that source of truth. And my experience is when it comes to a procedural book, most companies there don't have it, or they have like a 200-page manual. And I would love to see customers in between find that sweet spot. But we'll get into all that later. But it's just good to think about, what is it that you need to be successful? And it goes back to clean data, proper organization, whether it be by folders, making sure the metadata is filled out, making sure the part numbers aren't getting in your way and you have room to grow. And it also goes back to maintaining a 1, 3, and 5-year plan for Vault, and making the decisions now to facilitate where you want to go. Is it adding the change process? Is it getting Vault linked to PLM so that you can use a change process that other business units can get access to, and add other things to it, like RMAs, or being able to use that, leverage that data? Is it simplifying the BOM structure of getting the BOM and then items to sync from Vault to ERP so that you can free up someone that's manually exporting and importing? There's, I'm a big fan of thinking about the end in mind and working our way back. And most things, when we work back, clean data is where it all starts. So I really appreciate your guys' time for joining us, and I look forward to next time.
Thanks, Jason.